Welcome to another episode of the Middle East News Hour. I'm really thrilled to be joined today by guest Colonel Joel Rayburn to talk about Syria in against the background of everything that's happening now in Ukraine with the United States, with Russia, with NATO. There's another story that's going on or developing simultaneous with the drama in Ukraine, and that's a rising strategic presence of the Russians in Syria. And I thought that there would be nobody better to talk about this with than with Colonel Joel Rayburn. And I'm just going to read Colonel Rayburn's biography so that you can all understand why this podcast is going to be with him. So he's an historian of the Middle East and a former diplomat and military officer. He's currently writing a history of the Syrian conflict under a research grant from the Smith Richardson Foundation. Previously, he served as special advisor for the Middle East in the office of Senator Bill Hagerty, a big friend of Israel. I was really happy to meet here when he came with Senator Ted Cruz last year. But most importantly, for our purposes, from July 2018 to January 2021, Rayburn was a U.S. Special Envoy for Syria. In that post, he oversaw U.S. diplomatic activities concerning Syria. He supervised more than 100 diplomats and civil servants across the Middle East and Europe. And from November 2020 to January 21, served as U.S. Chief of Mission for Syria. Until November 2020, Rayburn was also Deputy Assistant Secretary for Levant Affairs, responsible for implementing U.S. policy concerning Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. Before joining the State Department, he served for 26 years as a U.S. Army officer, with his final assignment as Senior Director for Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon at the National Security Council staff in 2017 and 2018. He was commissioned from West Point in 1992, and he served several assignments in Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, and the United States, including several deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Bosnia. He's a field artillery officer in the 1st Armored Division from 93 to 96, during which he deployed to Kuwait as part of Operation Intrinsic Action and to Bosnia-Herzegovina as part of NATO's I-4. Then he transferred to military intelligence in 97. He served at Fort Huachuca in Arizona and in the 4th Infantry Division at Fort Hood. He also served as a Balkans intelligence analyst at EUCOM Joint Analysis Center. All of this is, of course, very relevant to what we're talking about now, because you're seeing with the deployment of strategic forces by the Russians in Syria these days, there's a lot of connection between what's happening in the Balkans, between Russia and Ukraine, the Black Sea, the Dardanelles, and what's happening in Syria. So this is all very important. And then he was on General David Petraeus's staff in Baghdad from 2007 to 2011. He was strategic intelligence advisor to General Petraeus in Iraq, and at Central Command in Tampa and in Afghanistan. So all of this is very impressive. And so I want to just see my screen again and give a very warm welcome to you, Colonel Rayburn. Thank you very much for joining me on the News Hour and the Middle East News Hour this week. Thank you.
A big pleasure to be with you. There's a lot going on.
Yes, there's a lot going on, and I think you may be a very good person to talk to about a lot of it, because a lot of it is new, and we really need to get some significant analysis before we can even do any commentary. So first of all, just to bring people up to date, I think it was last week, Russia deployed hypersonic missiles and strategic bombers to Syria. They also deployed nuclear-capable missiles to Syria. And so that's what the big new development is. In the midst of everything happening in Ukraine, the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu found it necessary to fly to Latakia, to the Russian bases there. Before we go into what's going on in Syria, let me just ask you this question, just general question. How does Russia see Syria? What is Syria for Russia?
There's several. That's a really good question. They see it from several different angles. The first one is that the Assad regime is their main regional client, and having lost the Gaddafi regime in Libya, they made a decision to pull out all the stops to preserve their client regime in Damascus uh, ever since, for the last 11 years, and not lose their further foothold. I mean, the Syrian regime, going all the way back into the mid Cold War, has been, especially with the loss of the Soviet and Egypt relationship um, in '73. Syria is the foothold for sort of the high Cold War Russian interests in the region. So they wanted to hold on to that. They wanted to preserve it, not be not leave the region. Then over time, they saw it as an opportunity to expand their little beachhead in the Eastern Mediterranean, to upgrade their presence, their naval presence, their air and ground presence in that Latakia region, at Humeimim Air Base, which was just a small sleepy thing. They really expanded it, and it's a big hub for military activity uh, in Syria, and so they've actually gotten a bigger foothold on the edge of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Northern Middle East than they had uh, in 2011 or before 2011, and that's important to them for power projection.
I heard
Uh,
that this was also sort of a training ground for the Russian
yeah,
military. Can you
that's
explain a little bit?
absolutely right. Yeah, they've used Syria as a proving grounds for their military technology, for their armaments, for a couple of different ways. They're able to test them on the battlefield, and then by their use, that's also marketing, because the Russians, for them, arms sales are such a huge revenue stream. They need a place, or it was advantageous to them to have a place where they're constantly introducing the latest, showing the effectiveness of their stuff on their wares on the battlefield, and that continues today. So they put the S-300 air defense system there. They have all their S-200 air defense systems, and a lot of other weaponry. So it was very much in the same way that, for example, Nazi Germany used the Spanish Civil War as a testing grounds and a proving grounds for the military capabilities that they would deploy
Well, in a
just
way, I mean,
in '39.
you could say that the United States did the same thing with the Israelis in the first Lebanon war in 1982, that the Israeli airstrikes that were able to destroy the
Yeah,
Soviet SAMs showed that the US technology was more powerful than the Soviet technology back then as well. So,
that's right. And the Israeli Air Force just shooting Hafez al-Assad's Air Force out of the sky with
mhm.
almost no losses in a really unequal, uneven fight. That you're absolutely right. That had a strategic impact. And so the Russians see Syria as that. There's another aspect. The Russian military has been rotating through. They don't have many people in Syria at any one time. I would be surprised if they have more than 5,000, somewhere between 4 and 5,000 at any given time, but they're rotating them through all the time. So there's a large portion of the Russian military that has field experience in Syria, and so that's not something that you can just get anytime. And it's been kind of like a training ground for their own military and their paramilitaries, the Wagner group and so on, and the same techniques then that they've used in eastern Ukraine and Libya and so on. They honed those capabilities in Syria and are still doing that. But there's another aspect to the military involvement. It's kind of strange when you first hear about it, but Russian military officers, for them, a command deployment or a senior staff deployment to Syria is a hot ticket. They compete and jostle to be the ones to go there, and that's because it's a money making scheme. And it more and more over the years, I think it's come to be viewed by the Russian General Officer Corps as a way to augment their pensions or their salaries. Because one of the first things that senior commanders do when they rotate into Syria is they look to try to get assets. They get the Syrian regime to give them property or a share of a mine or some kind of, or a railhead or a port and so on, or share of a gas field or an oil field.
Why
I
would
mean,
the
this is
Syrians do that? I mean, they're just deployed officers. Why would they give them a piece of the pie?
it's understood. That's the price. That's the compensation that the Syrians award to the Russian military, to Shoigu and his institution, to keep up the support and to keep up the military blank check to the Syrian regime. I mean, it's something. It's kind of unthinkable for the U.S. military, but that's what they're doing. They're there. There's a personal enrichment stake that the Russian General Officer Corps has in Syria, and so they don't have an incentive to bring the thing to a conclusion. That for it to keep for the conflict to be perpetuated, that's in their interest. They can keep testing their weapons, they can keep getting combat experience, and they can keep getting the money. There's
Okay, well,
another.
all of these are all on an organizational level, and even
Yeah,
on a what about on a strategic level? So they see Syria
right.
as this proving ground, as a place to enrich themselves. They want to show that they
Yeah,
want to market their weapon systems to sell them, and they want to be loyal, or they want to keep their asset in the Arab world afloat. Assad. What about from a Russian strategic interest perspective?
they would like to they would like to break the U.S. led security architecture in the region. They would like to they would like to sever or be able to control or pressure the natural channel, the strategic link between the energy producers of the Gulf region and the energy consumers of Europe in particular. Um, there's also the Far East as the energy consumers. That's more the Iranians that are looking to influence that. I haven't seen that the Russians view that as, but to try to interrupt that natural north south channel between the Gulf, Turkey, Europe. That is the great game there, and to try to get us to relinquish uh, our 4 or 5 decades grip on those relationships, and to compete with us there, and derange that security system. One of
You
the
mentioned,
ways
but
that
I don't want to interrupt you. I actually want to go back to this. But what about Iran? You mentioned Iran, and that sort of, I mean, Russia came in, I think it was in 2013, to fight on behalf of Assad with Iran and Hezbollah. So, I mean, Iran is Russia's ally in
oh yeah,
Iran.
absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Their interests are in concert. I mean, I've seen
are they in
over the
complete
years.
alignment? Because there's been a lot of talk that
No,
they aren't. I mean, Israel is
no,
some
they're
assuming
not in
they're
complete
not.
alignment. They're not in complete alignment. But these tactical disagreements that they have, kind of at a lower level in Syria, I have never seen it translate into a rift at the top between Moscow and Tehran. They remain aligned, and because the Iranians also share the same goal, which is to establish an east-west axis across the northern Middle East that interrupts the relationship, the strategic link between the Gulf region and Europe. And the Iranians want to be able to sit astride that, control it. They want to be able to control the flow of energy out of the Persian Gulf region and across the northern Middle East, and then they think they're going to be that'll make them a superpower, the Iranian regime, and the Russians the Russians don't appear to have a problem with that, and they enable it. The other thing that the Russians have done in Syria is they very skillfully have done what General McMaster used to call the bait and switch strategy, which is for all of the actors that have a stake in the Syrian conflict, the Russians present themselves as the constructive partner. So to the Israelis, the Russians advertise themselves as the only power that can restrain the Iranian regime from using Syria to attack Israel and others. Uh, for us, they would pitch to our national security community that they're natural allies, and Assad is a natural ally in counterterrorism. For the Turks, that they can, the Russians pitch themselves as the power that can restrain the PKK, and on and on and on. For the Europeans, the Russians are the natural partner against the European jihadis going to Syria and then going back and wreaking havoc and so on. They cannot deliver on any of their pitches, and they have no intention of delivering on any of their pitches
Why
because
can't they deliver? I mean, Russia can
well,
restrain Iran if it wants to. It can.
yeah. But here's the thing: at the same time that the Russians are offering themselves to the Israelis as the power that can restrain the Iranians, they're offering themselves to the Iranians as the power that can restrain the Israelis, and and so on. So they can't be all things to all people, and they don't have any intention of delivering. Of actually delivering on any of that. Their real game, they will use that as the entree for their real interest, which is to try to undo the U.S. strategic position in the Middle East. They want to make it so that the Saudis, for example, have to split the difference between the Russians and us, that the Emiratis have to, that the Israelis have to, et cetera, et cetera. That's what they're after.
So they're after making it very difficult for all traditional U.S. allies to just be pro-American because
Right.
they have to keep Russia in mind as well all the time, and Russia
Right.
will exact a price from Israel if Israel goes with the United States on Ukraine, for instance, as we're
Yeah.
experiencing now.
Yeah, and I think they would like to get a strategic ascendancy over the energy producers of the Persian Gulf, so that those energy producers can't threaten Russia's energy, monopoly, or their extremely large energy influence into Europe in particular. I think that's really what they're after, and I think after the last few years, certainly from the Obama administration on, they think they can do it. They
Well,
think they can achieve that.
that was what I was going to say, is that it looks like they're achieving all of their goals.
They, it, um, they have a ceiling, and it's my experience in government wasn't that they're invincible, but rather that they're mostly uncontested. That it's very rare. It's very rare uh, to see people actually formulating a strategy on the basis of what I just described. Um, but when they do, or when some of these powers call the Russians bluff, often the Russians have to give way
Like,
because they're not actually all powerful, and they can't afford to do much more on the ground in Syria than they're doing now. They've kind of topped out. So the Turks located that ceiling in terms of the strategic capability, the military capability in 2020 in Idlib, because the Turks dealt the Russians and Assad and Hezbollah a big defeat, and there's nothing that the Russians could do about it.
how did
Uh,
they do that? What was it that
well,
they
well,
saw
you
and
know,
what they
you
did?
know, for about a year and a half, the Russians and Assad were doing kind of a nibbling at the edges of the opposition held territory in northern Syria, northwest Syria. Um, but it got to a point. It got to a point where it encroached too closely on Turkey's border, and the Turks then sponsored a counterattack, and they used the technology that they had developed. So the swarm of drones, that tactic of using Turkish commandos and proxy Syrian ground fighters, and using their air advantage to destroy the Syrian regime military and the Russians' military hardware from the air. And the Russians and the Assad regime had no answer, and they still don't.
Didn't that happen
So
the same thing in Nagorno-Karabakh? Isn't that
it happened 3 times in 2020. Yeah, that's absolutely right. People don't realize this. I've been surprised at how this is missed. That the Turks and their allies defeated the Russians and their allies 3 times in 2020, and the defeat got worse each time, from Idlib to Libya to Nagorno-Karabakh, and the military balance in the northern Middle East and in the Caucasus changed in a way that the Russians don't have an answer for yet. I guess we'll see in Ukraine whether they're, and it may be that partly one of the things that's driving what they're doing in Ukraine is the need to try to restore the perception of military ascendancy over Turkey and its allies. But that was certainly the case in Syria. It was that the Turks leapfrogged, the Turks and their allies leapfrogged right over the Russians, Assad and Hezbollah in 2020, and that's why you haven't seen another Russia Assad foray into Idlib. It's the war part of the war where the Assad regime was trying to go from military victory to military victory is over, because Turks, they could, what the Turks showed on the battlefield in Idlib in February, March of 2020 was that they could destroy the Syrian army whenever they want. They could.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't want to. I don't want to keep going. I have a question, a follow-on question when you finish.
Sure. I mean, back in at the first week of March 2020, there was a ceasefire and armistice that Putin and Erdogan agreed to in Sochi on March 5th. But on that day, the road from where the Turkish front lines to Aleppo was just almost wide open. There was no reason that if the conflict had gone on for another week or two or three, that the Turks couldn't have just encircled Aleppo again, and that would have been the end of the war for the Assad regime. So that was
why
was a
didn't
real
Turkey just do that?
That
would have been a good thing.
That's a good question. It's a good question. The Turks, I think had that confrontation come at the end of 2020, with Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh in the rearview mirror, they might have gone on ahead. But in early 2020, they hadn't yet had those further victories over Russia and its allies, and they weren't sure that they could that they had escalation dominance.
Could they do that now, conceivably? I mean, could that be a NATO response to Ukraine? Would be to bring down the Assad regime in Syria? I mean, that would be a huge strategic hit for Russia and to any imperial aspirations that the Russians might have.
Well, what Putin does when he's in a confrontation with Turkey, he escalates by shooting down aircraft or killing some of their troops or shutting off the flow of tourism or closing the border to commerce, and that's always something that the Turks have to take that into consideration. So Putin, the Turks showed that on the battlefield they've got the advantage, but when you zoom out from it and you have these other aspects, the political aspect, the economic aspect, then Putin has some rejoinders that he can use, and the Turks have chosen not to test that.
You
so
talked
far.
about,
but they could.
You talked about the irregular forces, the Wagner group that the Russians are deployed in Syria. And when we were backing and forthing before we arranged this show, I asked whether you had been at the National Security Council when it was in 2018, I think, when the Wagner group tried to take over the Conoco oil fields that the United States controls with the Kurdish forces, and the U.S. killed something like 500 Wagner group troops were trying to cross a river, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
The Euphrates.
The Euphrates in one night. So that was another aspect of Russia's strategy of using irregular forces that failed in Syria, right?
It failed when they went up against U.S. Special Operations Forces. Yes, when the Wagner group fighters have just sort of roamed around the battlefield killing Syrians, they haven't had. So they haven't had a similar
So what is their job in
experience.
Syria then? What is the Wagner Group? You said that there are 5,000 Russian force. I guess that's regular Russian forces on any given day.
Yeah,
How many mercenaries are in Syria? Russian
that
mercenaries.
really that really I'd have to really look into it, because the Wagner guys, they're the little green men, the little green men that we first saw in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine, that then show, and so they tend to go where the Russians want to wage a war, in a uh, an unacknowledged, non-attributional way. And so I mean, there have been times where they were almost gone from Syria because they were over in Libya, or they were in Nagorno-Karabakh, or they were, somewhere else. So that really waxes and wanes. They're essentially an arm of the Russian state, an arm of the Russian military, but that's waging war by self. They also they do it for profit. So the Wagner Group, um, they have some military objectives, but they will also go in Syria where they can scarf up assets. They can seize a gas field, or they can seize a port, or they can seize money, or what have you, seize some kind of asset. They're looking to plunder. So that's a. It's possible that they're also that there are Spetsnaz, for example, that are doing that as well. In an unacknowledged way, uh, for the Russians. But
So
they're just another. They're another tool in the Russian military kit bag. They're
so
not independent actors. They're sent there as a matter of Russian state policy.
right. So let's just go one more layer of the Russian presence in Syria, and then we can move to uh, the United States in Syria, because that's another actor that we have to understand. So I started this discussion that the reason why I wanted to talk about Russia and Syria is because of the deployment of the hypersonic missile and the nuclear bombers in Syria last week. What do you make of this deployment? Why do you think that they're doing it now?
Well, I mean, um, I'm never sure what they're actually doing. There are a lot of some of those reports that come out. Sometimes it comes from the Russians themselves,
This came from the
and
Russians, right?
and
This
it's
was a
so it's
Russian.
part of a side. Yeah, oftentimes it's part of psyop. This is messaging, it's signaling. It's never so it's concerning, but when you look at the military capabilities that the U.S. and U.S. allies have around the region, what the Russians can put into Syria is minuscule. Um, that doesn't mean it's not a problem. Uh, Defense Minister Shoigu showing up in at Humeimim Air Base the other day, and essentially implying that Humeimim, that air base, could be brought into service in a war with Ukraine, and so that Syria would become a base for Russian military operations into Europe. I mean, that's crossing some red lines. Uh, but the military balance, the Russians really in Syria, they get a lot out of a small footprint. They get an awful lot out of a small footprint, uh, and I don't know how sustainable it would be for them to try to really increase that. It's expensive, but it is a danger. No, so it's they're doing that for signaling. They're doing that as part of the game of risk and brinksmanship that they're involved in. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's one hell of a signal, though, sending hypersonic missiles to Syria, and presumably pointing them at the Dardanelles, and I mean, that's saying that the battlefield has just been expanded to the Levant, and that the Levant, from our strategic purposes, is part of the European battlefield as well. I mean, that's something that didn't happen in the Cold War because nobody had that kind of power projection the way that you have now with these missiles. So, I mean, that's a new development that seems to me, to have independent strategic significance, just sort of regardless of what else. And you think that, well, if they have one or two hypersonic missiles. I mean, I don't know what number they have there. That's not actually a game changer in terms of the strategic realities in Europe, or
I don't think
the
it.
battlefield.
At that level, I don't think it would be. And the other thing that I would look at is, Turkey it has a very powerful military capability,
I
and
just keep
if
looking at my area map on my wall when you're talking.
yeah, if 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 the
Everybody should
Russians
get out their
really
maps when they're watching the show so that you know what in the hell we're talking about. Yeah.
remember, so Russia and Turkey are really, they're just kind of in a pause to this long running war that they've had going back to, when the Russians first started making war on Idlib. And it looks to me like the Turks have been at war with the Russians since 2015, 2016. They're just kind of in a pause. And if the Russians were to try to move significant new capabilities into Syria, Turkey is the biggest target for that, more so than Europe. And past a certain point, the Turks don't have to accept that. The Turks, if it really comes down to it, and the Russians are establishing a strategic outpost there that would be a real threat to Turkey, at a certain point, it becomes just in the interest of the Turks to just stop that, intervene in a much bigger way than they've done, take Aleppo back out of the regime's hands, etc. Which they can do. Um, so it's this is I think, but the Russians take these risks, and the Russians push and push and push and push, and if they don't hit pushback, they'll keep going, and that's what this represents. I think when they get pushback, they will back off. If you remember a couple of years ago, um, they were engaged in this thing where they had some reckless uh, patrols up in northeast Syria, trying to run our people off the road and stuff like that.
Well, they were
And
just
so
buzzing US forces, I think,
they
in
were,
Banff this week. They were buzzing US forces at the air base
yeah,
in Banff.
yeah. To see what we'll do, it's like a game of chicken. They will lose. I mean, we have the capability to just squash them, and they know that. So it's just a matter of how
Where
restrained we want to
in
be.
Syria?
Anywhere in the Middle East, they cannot match us, nor can the Iranians. And there was a so the way that the U.S. Commanders put a stop to that Russian harassment nonsense in the Northeast was that they quietly moved M1 tanks into the Northeast, and Bradley fighting vehicles, and they just kind of started patrolling with them. I don't think they even really moved the tanks around. They just kind of, I think they just moved them there and sat them there.
But which year
And
was
but
this?
this was 2019, 2020.
Mhm.
I was probably 2020. I'd have to go back and look, but there's been a couple of times where CENTCOM and the command in Baghdad have just moved an armored capability into eastern Syria, or an artillery capability into eastern Syria, and said, "Okay, yeah, you want to escalate? Okay, here's checkmate." And the Russians have had to back off because they can't match what we would put there. If there was a time where I think the CENTCOM commander put a battalion minus, meaning part of the battalion of armor, U.S. armor, into eastern Syria, and when CENTCOM did that, that small armor force became the most powerful military force in Syria. And really, if you'd zoom back out from it and looked at the military balance, there was nothing. If that battalion had gotten the orders to drive to Damascus, there's nothing in Syria that could stop them.
I mean, that's once I want to take a step back, but I have to say I find that hard to believe, only because they have anti-tank capabilities. I mean, Israeli armored columns that were going into Lebanon in 2006 were attacked by Cornet missiles. Then I
It's a
mean,
whole different no, it's a whole different ball game when because a U.S. armored force has an air cap over it it has intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance over it, and no one's going to be able to get close. So without being knocked out of the sky or killed way beforehand, and there's not any force on force. That's if they just if a U.S. tank battalion just got to drive from Hasaka, cross the river, go to Palmyra, etc. There's literally nothing in Syria that could stop them. That's the actual. So what we're dealing with, Caroline, in the northern Middle East and across the whole Middle East, we're dealing with a lot of weak actors relative to U.S. power. And they're so weak as they look formidable when you just look at them against one another. But it's sort of like if a high school kid came upon a group of third graders that are fighting each other, and the one high school kid's going to be able to break up the fight or do anything that they want. That's the actual relative power, and we miss that because the U.S. doesn't use that. We don't project that kind of power very much. We don't use what's in the arsenal. But if you look at it, sorry, go ahead.
No, but I mean, but I guess that I think first of all, I want to take a step back for a second and talk about the United States presence in Syria,
Yeah,
and what it signifies and what it accomplishes. I think that you get more bang for your buck with I think it was 900 forces that the U.S. has deployed in Syria than you have for U.S. forces almost anywhere else that you
right.
can think of, because of the
Yeah,
way that they're strategically planted on that border area between Jordan and Iraq and Syria, and
right.
the air base and what kind of power projection that gives them. But can you talk a little bit about that? Because and talk about it in a couple of ways. I mean, one of them is that there was a lot of criticism of Obama when he brought them in, because the strategic problem for the United States is it was never ISIS. ISIS was always just yuck, and horrible, but it wasn't a strategic threat. A strategic threat to US allies, to US forces, and to US interests in the Middle East was always Iran. And yet the Obama
Yeah,
administration deployed the forces in Syria specifically against ISIS, and actually tried to at least pretend that they were cooperating with the Iranians in the fight against ISIS to legitimize the Iranians, while Obama was negotiating the JCPOA in 14 and 15. And then Trump really wanted to get them out of Syria, along with his larger concept of wanting to withdraw U.S. forces from the Middle East, and hand things over to U.S. allies there to handle. So you've had this weird deployment where the actual enemy is not the enemy that the United States is supposed to be fighting in Syria, but rather this other guy, ISIS, and yet and so it's not clear what the United States seeks to accomplish with its presence in Syria. I know that I was really up in arms personally, on a personal level, when I found out that Donald Trump wanted to take them out, given the the stability that such a small force brings. And then he was convinced to leave the 900 forces there. But talk a little bit about what U.S. forces do in Syria and what they don't do, and then I think we should move a little bit to the question of U.S. will, and how the lack of will or presence of will manifests itself over time, and how we're supposed to look at it today as well.
well, the first thing I would say is that ISIS is still a problem. It's and it's a problem. My experience in Iraq was just watching watching us destroy ISIS, or destroy ISIS or its forerunners, right, in the field as a fighting force, and then lift the pressure, and then they come right back. It's just like you're sweeping the water out and it just runs back in. I pointed out to my team over time that since 2003, Mosul has changed hands 8 times, and if if we're just going to leave, if we're just going to lift the pressure, it's going to change hands again. There are be people who say, "Well, that's not really our problem." I mean, but it is our problem. It is our problem because it becomes a basis of a threat our allies in the region, some of whom are vulnerable to an ISIS kind of movement and military force. It becomes a real threat to Europe. What really catalyzed U.S. action wasn't just ISIS taking over Mosul and eastern Syria and so on. It's that in 2015, ISIS began to project into Europe to
Right.
try to provoke basically a European civil war. That is really what they were trying to do, to make inroads into the Muslim communities of Europe and provoke a religious war. And they didn't do. They showed that they had some pretty good reach from Syria and Iraq. So it's something that you can't just leave alone. Um, Geopolitically, it does not approach the scale of the Iranian
They're
regime
not
because that's
proliferating nuclear weapons, and they don't
all
have
that
terror armies
exactly.
that they've raised and that they control all over the region.
They're not able exactly. They're not able to draw upon state resources and so on, and to use the resources of a country of 90 million people and a $700 billion economy. So there's no. You're absolutely right. There's no comparison in the scale of the threat, strategically speaking. But I don't have any doubt that if we were just to sort of close up shop tomorrow in Syria and Iraq, the ISIS will be right back in short order, because I've seen that happen over and over and over again. The same. So the troops, the military mission of trying to handle ISIS and crunch them as a clandestine terrorist network in Syria and Iraq, that's still out there. In TANF, there's still a military mission against ISIS, because having that presence in the TANF circle prevents ISIS from taking the easiest routes between Syria and Iraq and Jordan, and it's a huge thing. Now, the corollary effect, which was important for me in the White House, and then as a sort of Syria political guy, was that as you're doing that military mission against ISIS in the northeast and in the southeast of Syria, you are denying the best highways to Qasem Soleimani, the dearly departed Qasem Soleimani's armies, and to have that east-west strategic axis that the Iranian regime wants to be able to consolidate in order to fight a war against Israel. So it's vital that those troops stay there. Those troops don't have to be fighting the Iranians to have a really big impact on the Iranians, on the Iranian regime and Hezbollah and so on. They're also strategically, the best resources that Syria has as a country, they're the oil, the gas, the wheat, a lot of the water is right up there in the northeast, where the U.S. troops are sitting, and so it would be not smart to abandon that, and that's why President Trump, having made sort of initial moves to withdraw us completely, then sort of the pendulum swung back because the geographical reality, the strategic reality of these other aspects of eastern Syria came into play. I was not a fan of pulling troops out of Syria. At my little level, I advised against that, and I'm glad that we didn't, because we, as you put it, we get a lot of bang for the buck for just the several hundred troops that are there. I would not like. Plus, if they weren't there, then you'd have the Russians and Assad and Hezbollah and the Quds Force and the Iraqi Hashid controlling the entirety of the Euphrates Valley, right up on the Turkish border, right down on the Jordanian border, controlling that Syria-Iraq border completely. And then the Iranian regime, they have sort of a narrower artery that they can use to reach across Iraq, Syria, to the Golan, to Lebanon, and to pose an unprecedented new threat to Israel and to Jordan, and actually to Turkey, because they project power into Aleppo as well. But if we weren't there, they always have to be careful, because if really there was a war, then it wouldn't be that hard for us to pinch off that strategic channel, the ground part of it and the air part of it too, from the presence that we have. Uh, so it's a restraint. It's a bit of a deterrent against them in the event of a real escalation, a real confrontation. So it would be really unwise strategically for us to just give that up.
You know, David Wormser, who's my partner on this show, many very quite often. He he suggested to me today. We were exchanging texts about what's happening with Ukraine and with Syria and Russia. And the whole triangle, and he said, this is really a time to take down Assad. I mean, I mentioned it before, but if the United States wanted to retaliate, I mean, sort of like Putin is kind of, I don't know if he's a master, but he's certainly good at misdirection. His announcement that he was recognizing the independence of two eastern provinces in Ukraine that he's essentially, that he's controlled for the past several years. It gets people confused, and it hits them where they weren't expecting, and they keep expecting that frontal invasion of Ukraine, and ends up that he's just taking Ukraine apart piece by piece, and saying, okay, this is how I'm going to move. I'm just moving, I'm moving my queen forward, just one. What are you going to do now, right? Because you were expecting a whole move along the chessboard, and that's not what you're getting. And if the United States wanted to say, okay, well, we're gonna take out Assad, or we're gonna threaten your presence in Syria another way, take away your foothold there. Um, we're gonna take away some asset that you have. We're gonna back is because what the Biden administration has sort of walked back their backing of Israeli airstrikes in Syria, so that without that full U.S. backing of Israeli operations in Syria, the Russians feel much more at ease with trying to limit what Israel is doing in Syria in a way that they wouldn't have done under Trump, and in a way that they tried to do under Obama. So the U.S. could take some more assertive actions in Syria if it wanted to, and this really speaks to U.S. will, right? Because a lot of U.S. allies, I know Israel is certainly one of them, is looking at what the Biden administration is doing, and its sort of flaccid response to Iranian and Iranian proxy aggression against U.S. allies like the UAE, Saudi, and so on and so forth. And they're saying, well, what can we get from Russia? Egypt, that's under sanctions for God only knows what reason from the Biden administration, is now seeming to become a much more active purchaser of military equipment from Russia, which Russia, I'm sure, hopes to be able to use to extend their strategic reach back to the Suez Canal for the first time since '73. So you're looking at a whole force projection thing that's a spoiler, that you have U.S. pullback, you have U.S. Realignment towards Iran and away from Israel and the Sunnis, and you have Russia taking advantage of this.
I think so. Okay, on there's the question of capabilities. Could the U.S. intervene in Syria in a way and just sort of uh, um, let's say collapse the Russians' main client there?
Support
Yes,
support
obviously we could
Turkey.
do that.
Support Turkey with elections.
Support Turkey. Yes, yeah, that is very yeah, that's doable. Um, whether having spent most of 2021 in Congress and been, having lived there in Washington for quite a while, hard for me to imagine that there would be the political will in Washington or anywhere in the United States for that kind of intervention. Certainly, as we're thinking about it now. I mean, if you get a couple of moves into this game, this confrontation with the Russians, then maybe that the will would appear. But what what I what I have noticed is that there are a lot of things short of that that there very much would be support to do here in Washington that are not being done. The Caesar Act is the very first one that comes to mind.
What's that?
The Caesar Act is the act passed by Congress, and it takes its name from the photographs that the Syrian military photographer smuggled out, which showed just the Holocaust-like mass murder and torture that the Assad regime was carrying out. And so it's a really hard-hitting sanctions program against the Assad regime and its allies. And President Trump signed it into law in December of 2019. It took effect in June of 2020, and we were issuing sanctions under the auspices of that program until the end of the Trump administration, and then it just kind of has gone on pause. And one of the reasons I think that it went on pause was that the U.S. government has been in a mode for more than a year of, whether it's Syria or Iran, of being in a mode of sort of going along to get along with the Russians. And so I think there was the idea of, because the Caesar Act was this inexorable economic pressure and political isolation on the Assad regime, it was so heavy, it was having such an impact on the regime that it was clear neither Assad nor the Russians were resilient to it. They just had no answer for it. That would have, if it kept up, I think it probably would have led to the collapse of the regime, or certainly bring the regime to the brink of collapse, where the Russians and Assad would have had to cry uncle and negotiate it into the conflict, that in a way that they don't want to have to do. But those punches were pulled in 2021 in favor of working with the Russians to get UN Security Council action to keep cross-border humanitarian assistance flowing and stuff like that. Well, I think, when you're seeing what Putin is doing in Ukraine, the idea of pulling your punches on the Russians' main regional client in the interest of getting along with the Russians should be out the window. There's no rationale. I don't think there was a valid rationale all along, but there certainly shouldn't be one now. And I think if I were, the king of America, I would be slapping back those sanctions. I would be doing new sanctions every week, every 2 weeks, every month on the Assad regime. I would be doing it on Russian companies, on the Russian military industrial complex for their activities in Syria, on the Iranian regime and Hezbollah for their activities in Syria. None of that's being done in a really significant way.
But that also conflicts with the Biden administration's chief foreign policy aim, which is to appease Iran and to get a deal with them. So imposing sanctions on Assad, who is an Iranian proxy, or on Hezbollah or on Iran itself, is antithetical to that goal, right? Also Russia, because they actually want Russia on board for the nuclear deal.
Yeah, I was in the Senate when then Secretary of State nominee designate Tony Blinken and Deputy Secretary of State designee Wendy Sherman came before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and said that the Biden administration was not going to do that they were not going to just relegate Syria or any other security problem to being just a card that is used in the JCPOA, in the negotiations over the JCPOA. So, and certainly this situation in Ukraine, I think any reasonable strategist here in Washington would see that there's just absolutely no reason. There's no reason that makes any sense in not pouring on the pressure on the Assad regime and certainly other Russian clients as well. But those aren't in my lane. The big one that's in my lane, and it's hugely important to all of the people, the same decision makers in Russia who are doing what they're doing in Ukraine, are the decision makers in Syria. They're the same actors controlling Russian policy in Syria. And so I think it makes perfect sense. Not just that, but the Caesar Act, it is, if the United States is not going to stand for the idea of never again, we're not. This is meant to be a principle that is consistent from administration to administration. Is when a rogue regime models itself on Nazi Germany during the Holocaust, that's supposed to be crossing a red line. Where it isn't. It's not just in our moral interest, but it's in our strategic interest not to allow that precedent to be set, so that rogue regimes and dictators do a carbon copy of that approach all over the world in the coming century. So there was never. I don't think there was never a legitimate case for pulling the pressure off of the Assad regime, and there certainly isn't when we're looking for ways when we're looking for ways to impose costs on Vladimir Putin for his policy, not just in Ukraine but elsewhere. Then the Caesar Act, Syria sanctions, it seems to me, is the perfect place to start.
Okay, so I want to move to Israel, but just I think you had mentioned, or maybe I misheard you, that there were other things and that you would start with the Caesar Act. Where else would you go on that score? Are there other
Well,
things that you would suggest, or
yeah, I think now we've had so much hand wringing over sanctions on Russian assets on Nord Stream 2 and so on in Europe, but there have been precious few sanctions on Russia for what it's done in Syria. But the as I say, the Russian military, and you find the same big Russian military industrial entities are knee deep in Syria, the same ones that we would target over Ukraine. So it seems to me, why I don't think we should have let them skate for so long, based on what they've done in Syria. So uh, I think it's a perfect place to impose costs, not just on Assad himself, but also on the Russians directly for what they've done in Syria.
so that brings me to where I'm sitting, Israel. Israel's been significantly challenged, obviously, by Russia and their presence in Syria. When the Russians came in and they installed their S-300s and S-400s, Israel, for the first time, lost its air superiority since 1982, when, as you mentioned earlier in this broadcast, Israel destroyed the Syrian Air Force, which was Russian technology based and supported. Um,
Yeah,
and so this has been a strategic shift of epic proportions for Israel. And now, in order to try to deconflict our air sorties into Syria, we're doing this. We have this coordination mechanism with the Russians that sometimes they pull away from, sometimes they go back to, and Israel is constantly in a state of concern that we're going to end up in a conflict with Russia. Um, and Russia, like you said, they're doing a bait and switch with Israel as well, because they're both protecting Iran and its presence in Syria, as well as Hezbollah and its presence in Syria and Lebanon, and they're also limiting their operations there. And I actually think that Putin could come to the Iranians and say, I'm limiting the Israelis, and he would be telling the truth. And he could come to the Israelis and say, I'm limiting the Iranians, and he'd be telling the truth. That is, he is playing one side, he is playing the middle against both sides. He's doing it successfully because everybody he is manipulating everybody. He's there. Nobody wants to get into a confrontation. Israel does not want to get into a confrontation with him. The Iranians need him for his air assets in protection of Assad. And so they can't get rid of him. So he's made himself the indispensable player, but he's also
yeah,
undermining Israel's power in the region in a very significant way. And now, and Israel's relations with the Biden administration are also very bad, because the Biden administration is realigning the United States towards Iran and away from Israel and the Sunnis, and that's just true. So Israel's looking at this. How if you were advising Israel, or if you were an Israeli looking at this with the knowledge that you have, what would you be seeing when you're looking at this situation? If you
well,
can
I
put
had
on
this
that cap
yeah,
for a second.
well, I had this, this was the issue on which I was dealing with Israeli counterparts for years,
Mhm.
and this one in Hezbollah, and
This what? What is
I
she?
the Syria issue plus Hezbollah,
Mhm.
and in particular and in particular, the whole the weapons factories, the new
Missiles.
missile improvement factories that the PGMs, precision guided munitions, that were showing up in Lebanon. But um, what there's been this unrealistic idea that I don't think is the majority view in Israel, but it's certainly a strong minority view in Israel, is that Assad can be he can be coaxed away from the Iranians, and that there's a way, and that, for example, if Israel would support the normalization of Assad, if Israel could convince the United States to lay off of Assad, that Assad and the Russians would then be able to expel the Iranians or expel them over time. Or, and in particular, for example, Emirati oil could show up and be a gift to Assad, and then that somehow, but the this is based on the premise that the Assad regime's relationship with the Iranian regime is just a marriage of convenience. It's
Mhm.
unfortunate. They have no other choice,
Well,
and,
I mean,
and all
it's a
this.
loose. This
It's
is the view of the Israeli left because they want to see.
Yeah,
They don't want to see a synergistic or a partnership between Iran and Syria because they don't want to believe it exists. And then they don't want to
it
believe that
yeah.
Iran, I mean, that Syria really does want to annihilate Israel because they think that if they can make it about real estate, then Israel can run away from the Golan, give it to Assad, and everything will be better. I mean, this is the fantasy
It
view
is
of the Israeli left.
fantastical. It is fantastical. This is an approach that's been tried over and over again. It never works,
Yeah.
and that's because the relationship between the IRGC and the Assad regime is hardwired. It's baked in, and 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 it's also, it's not a marriage of convenience for Bashar al-Assad. This is where his heart is. He thinks that his way to secure his place in history is to be on what he thinks is the winning side. He thinks the axis of resistance is the winning side in the coming century, and he's not going to give up that relationship. The only way, my judgment, and this is what I tried to, this was my input to U.S. policy and my advice to all the counterparts that I dealt with, was the only way to get the Assad regime and the Russians to actually do what the Israelis and others would require for their existential security needs would be to bring the Assad regime at least to the brink of collapse. They would have to get to the point where there was no alternative. The only choice between them was doing what all the good guys require, or collapse, or the end. And only then
But we're
would
not even
they.
close to that. I mean, there
But
that's not even in a distant
not right now.
flicker,
You're
in the
Well, actually, so here, this was my other experience: is that the Assad regime is so incredibly weak and
today.
vulnerable oh yeah, in ways that we can affect. That if the pressure valve has, the rheostat has been turned down, but if it were turned back up, there's not really much that Assad and the Russians could do about it. And this is in particular the economic pressure is what I'm talking about. They're so shaky. They remain really vulnerable, and they just can't, they can't get the resources that they would need to be able to survive a true return to a pressure policy. That was the theory of the case in the Trump administration. That was what, under Secretary Pompeo's guidance, that's what Jim Jeffrey and I were. That's what we were implementing, and we were making pretty good headway. But then, then we were invited to leave.
It's invited very nicely to leave. But I mean, I think that, and not only were you invited to leave, and not only were the sanctions ended effectively or no longer enforced, but also the United States is now enabling Iran to get enriched by not enforcing the sanctions that still haven't been removed, and moving now with the negotiations in Vienna to remove whatever sanctions exist. It struck me. I'll just throw this out more for our viewers than for you. Is just that there's been a lot of talk about the Iranians demanding that the agreement be that the U.S. abdicate the ability to reinstate the sanctions, but
Yeah.
but that is kind of it's sort of a red herring because the agreement itself is supposed to end during Biden's term. And then all of the restrictions on Iran's nuclear operations are supposed to be removed, or I mean, they're only supposed to last for 2.5 more years because the initial agreement was until
Yeah.
2025.
And,
So
and
that
the arms embargo is already gone.
right,
So
so that there, I mean, it would be a completely different set of sanctions that would be put on. It wouldn't be put on in the framework of anything because the JCPOA or whatever this joke of an agreement is that's about to be signed, they end while Biden is president. So that's sort of a
yeah.
non-demand. It doesn't have any relevance.
Well, there's a really uh, unhelpful historical revisionism that's gone on that wants to depict the Iranian regime's regional aggression as a response to Trump leaving the JCPOA. And in fact, I'm sorry, I was there, and the regional aggression came before we left the JCPOA. And in fact, inside the Trump administration, there was a lot of division. Leave it, don't leave it. How do you leave it? When do you leave it? There was a lot of uncertainty, and I don't know what would have happened had, but I mean, President Trump's hand was forced not not just by the impending end of the restrictions on the nuclear program and on the arms embargo and so on, but by what Qasem Soleimani and by what the IRGC Missile Command were doing in the region, and that where in during a time when the United States had agreed not to sanction in response to those things, or when the United States couldn't reach an agreement with the Europeans in particular. I was part of those negotiating teams. I mean, already Qasem Soleimani and Abdulreza Shala'i, for example, were firing missiles at Riyadh, at Saudi cities, at Abu Dhabi before the United States left the Iran deal. And when we looked at what are the options, any good uh, strategic cell in an administration to say, well, here, Mr. President, these are your response options. And I'm sorry, Mr. President, you're unable to, you're in an agreement where you agree not to use economic pressure in response to these acts of war that the Iranian regime is committing against your allies. And that was unacceptable for any president, certainly for President Trump. So, there were envoys dispatched to the Europeans to say, look, what we've got right now is it's as though you've taken the United States economic pressure tools, which is it's some of the most effective tools we have, and we put them behind glass only in the service of the Iranian regime's nuclear program. Now they've got all these other things. They've got missile development, terrorism, human rights abuses. They're actually committing war against regional allies of yours, Europeans. Your energy producers. They're attacking. They attacked the G20 capital, Riyadh. That should matter to you. And you're saying you will not agree to us, that your ruling is that if we try to sanction the Iranian entities that are doing that we're abrogating the JCPOA. And so under those terms, the president was not going to stay in the deal. But so again, the hand was forced by all the things that the Iranian regime did under the cover of the JCPOA, which was their plan. That was the Iranians' plan.
Right, and if
If
you
you look,
add to that as well, the development of the advanced centrifuges during the lifespan of
yeah,
the
right,
deal, which was allowed, right? And so, David Wormser has argued it convincingly. He said, look, you mean the deal uh, was a snapshot of where Iran was, so that and it enabled Iran to get to where they are today, right? That they could only enrich to 367% in uranium, but that was all they could do in 2015. So it was enabling them to continue to do what they were doing, and it enabled them to develop what they needed to do next. And so, they were willing to give up some stockpile of the uranium in order to get international permission, the U.S. permission, the Security Council permission to then develop the second generation, third generation centrifuges that enabled them to enrich 10 times the rate and to much higher levels of purity, so that you're taking both the regional aggression, the missile development, the proxy wars, the terrorism
Yeah,
sponsorship, and you add
narco
that to
trafficking.
right, and you add that to the nuclear proliferation that was happening through R&D during the course of their, supposed respecting the limitations that the JCPOA placed on their nuclear deal, and you see that this was a proliferation, not a non-proliferation agreement. So I mean, there's and all of the counter, the anti-chronological uh, explanations of what happened with the deal are indeed unhelpful. But just for 1 second to go back to Israel and Syria. So obviously the peacenik thing, you're not going to, at the Caroline Glick Middle East News Hour, you're not going to get any arguments that the Israeli left's view of Assad is delusional and deeply detrimental to to Israeli national security, and by the way, to U.S. national security, as well as our all delusional strategic policies. But looking at it today, looking at the way that Putin is now, deploying strategic forces against presumably Turkey, the United States, NATO allies in Syria itself. Um, how would you look at this development as an Israeli? Would you be sanguine? Would you not care? Well, that hypersonic missile is not directed at us. That's overkill. Or would you look at it as an upgrade of Assad's strategic significance for Russia, and then as an indication that Russia may become more hostile to Israel? Or where do you see that from the regional actor's perspective, specifically this regional actor, Israel?
Okay, well, so I think um, anything the Russians do in Syria, uh, they do knowing that they can someday use it to make an implicit threat to Israel. And I think there was a difference of opinion in Israel on that ended with the incident where the Syrian regime shot down
Right.
a Russian plane in 2018. And the Russians knew that the Syrian regime shot it down, but the Russians blamed
Israel.
the Israelis for the shoot down and then set out to punish the Israelis for the shoot down, and took the opportunity to move advanced air defense systems into Syria, knowing full well that the Israelis had done nothing to endanger Russian presence and never would. And so that was such a betrayal, and I think it was an eye-opening moment for those in the Israeli system who held out the hope that, well, actually, Putin shares our interests, and and the scales fell away from the eyes in that incident. And so, if I were the Israelis, just on the strength of that example alone, I would be very, very concerned about anything that the Russians move into Syria, just as the Turks should be very concerned. Because even insofar, the Russians have not really used their military hardware against the Israelis. They've allowed the Syrian regime to use it against the Israelis, but they have used it against the Turkish military directly. And so both Turkey and Israel, I think, share this interest in not seeing the Russians expand their footprint.
So I think we have to close down because the Middle East News Hour, and we're already past that, which inevitably happens with me because I'm famously long-winded. But it seems to me that the take-home lesson for the United States from what Russia is doing in Syria, at the same time that it's massively escalating its aggression in eastern Ukraine, is to, as you say, re-implement and strongly implement or fully implement the Caesar Act. And from the Israeli perspective, I think and I think that the obvious play here, maybe not obvious, but the proper play would be to really see where Erdogan is going with his courtship of Israel, and to see how we could safely um, cooperate with Turkey
Yeah,
in Syria and in other places as well.
yeah, that would be a real game changer. It's such an obstacle to trying to get regional alignment against the Qasem Soleimani and Hezbollah threat. Um, uh, for example, I think that would be if there could be a, a a restoration of the kind of Israeli-Turkish strategic relationship that you had uh, before the ship incident way back when. That would be that would spell real trouble for the Iranian regime, Hezbollah, Assad, and Russia, and that would be the single biggest, most positive development strategically. Is if if U.S. allies could coordinate their regional strategy together in a way that hasn't been the case. And it's been a missed opportunity. We'll look at the opportunity cost for the last 10, 12 years
Well,
of that.
you gotta talk about that with Turkish voters who keep reinstating Erdogan as
I think
they're
it's
still.
doable. I mean, I think look, I think it's doable with Turkey as it is. With Turkey as it is, that this is still the sort of the tension, the misalignment among the different U.S. regional allies is not necessary. That can be overcome even with it, just even with the configuration that's there now. I have no doubt.
All right. Well, from your mouth to God's ears, and it looks like it may happen. President Herzog is going to be going to Turkey in a meeting that Erdogan asked for. So
Inshallah, inshallah.
right, exactly. We'll have to see. Bezrat Hashem. All right. Well, thank you so much, Colonel Joel Rayburn, for joining me today. I'll have you guys know that Colonel Rayburn is the first guest that I've had on this show that isn't an old friend of mine, but now you're a new friend. So we'll be very happy to have you
Voila,
back on the
voila.
show. Yeah, and we have to thank Victoria Coates, Dr. Coates, for making the introduction. I really appreciate it. And guys, obviously, this development with the Syrians and the Russians and everything happening in Europe, it works out that we're all due to in large part due to the range of a lot of these missiles, we're all one big happy, unhappy, dysfunctional neighborhood. And so everything touches everything else. And that's why this Middle East News Hour is your essential guide for understanding everything that's happening here. So watch this show. Obviously, you already have because you've gotten to this closing. Share this show, subscribe, and have everybody subscribe as well. Let's get the message out. Thank you so much, Colonel Rayburn, and thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you again next week. Take care.